Good evening and welcome everyone watching tonight on Facebook, on YouTube, and on GoToWebinar. Glad to have you here this evening. This is episode number 103 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we're going to go back 80 years in time to take a look at some of the major events of 1943. But before we get started, please do us a favor. If you haven't already done so, just take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you follow us. If you do subscribe on YouTube, click the bell icon and you'll get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when we go live. Now, as you're watching tonight, if you have any questions, just type them in the comments section of whatever platform you're on, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. So joining me is Chris Kolakowsi, director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. Welcome back, Chris, and glad to have you here.
It's good to be here, Steve.
We're 1943. This is, I guess, in my mind at least, it's sort of a turning point year. You have, obviously, for the United States, from the U.S. perspective, we entered the war in very late in 1941. 1942 was all about getting ramped up, manufacturing moving, troops trained, all these sorts of things. 44, you've got things like D-Day and the March in the Pacific, and of course 45 at the end of the war. So 1943 always seems just sort of an in-between, like the middle child, but there really were a lot of things that happened during 1943 that are pivotal events that help continue the progression to the end of the war and the eventual Allied victory.
I would agree with that. This is, that's why I titled it "The Struggle for Supremacy,"
Right.
Because 1942, the United States enters late in 41, as you mentioned. Then you get the Axis running wild and kind of trying to contain that, and you find that. And that's basically the theme for 1942. And then 1944-45 is then the push to victory. Well, 1943 is the essential kind of middle point. Think of it like you could say the middle rounds of a boxing match. You could use the middle movie of a trilogy. There's a couple of different analogies. The one that connects everything else. This is a year where you can really chart it with the progress of the year with the two major conferences. The first one in Casablanca in 1943, where Churchill and Roosevelt and the Allied leaders get together, and that's when they proclaim unconditional surrender. And basically, where Churchill and Roosevelt are winning the war. And then in Tehran, which we can get into later, at December 1943. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, the leaders of the so-called big three powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and of course the British Empire, get together to plan to win the plan for victory, plan to win the war in 1944 and 1945 if necessary against Germany and Japan. And you use those two milestones and you think about the agendas of those two conferences, and it demonstrates what happens this year and the importance of what happens this year.
It is amazing. And also thinking about just the logistics of bringing, in this case, in Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill together. There was no Air Force One. There was,
right.
And thinking about it, as I was reflecting on it today, it's like Roosevelt, the leader of, the United States, is going basically to the war zone to meet with Churchill. I mean, he's bringing himself closer to the action, as it were, than he would be in Washington. Do you recall any reason why Casablanca was selected as the spot for them to meet?
It was a good central location. It was out of range of German bombers, which was a big reason. If Roosevelt's going to cross the Atlantic in early 1943, he doesn't have a lot of destinations that would be out of range of the Luftwaffe. And Casablanca is one of those places. There's also some political piece to it as well, because it's French Morocco, and the idea of bringing the French back into the war, beginning to rearm the French. This is also one of those moments where they anoint Charles de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French and kind of the de facto leader of the French forces going forward. So there's a lot of reasons. You put all that together, and that's why Casablanca is chosen. It also, by the way, helps with marketing with the movie, because of course the movie Casablanca had just come out a few weeks before.
Yeah, and like the bomb the devils around the clock. That quote that comes from that, and also fitting because today is the anniversary of Ira Eaker taking over the 8th Air Force from General Spaatz.
Sure.
Happened on this date in 1943. So it's, again, ties that together.
And Eaker's the one who actually writes that in a memo. And that's actually a very significant moment, and particularly when you think about aviation history. There's several milestones in this year that happen. And this is one of them because, the 8th Air Force in 42 had some very significant growing pains and teething troubles. And the RAF was saying, you know what, the best thing is have the Americans just do night bombing and area bombing just like we are. Just we'll give it, more power in the thrusts and more power in the punches.
Mm-hmm.
And, Eaker, Arnold, you look at Air Force doctrine, going into the war, it's all daylight precision bombing. And, basically Churchill, by raising an objection and listening to his RAF leaders, the combined bomber offensive with everything that it ended up doing might never have happened. And Eaker is the one who saves it because he gets a message from Hap Arnold at Casablanca, said, you need to get down here now and you need to be here tomorrow morning and talk to Churchill. And he writes a memo of 8 points of why the 8th Air Force should be able to continue daylight precision bombing, at least in the near term, to see if it works. And one of the things he puts in there is, by bombing the devils around the clock, we will give them no rest. And there's a famous thing of when Churchill's reading this, and Eaker writes about it, and Churchill, he says, pauses and reads it aloud, and kind of, I forget the exact quote, but he turns the words over in his mouth like a morsel of meat. And that saved the combined bomber offensive because Churchill said, you know what, you've got a point. And let's see what the U.S. Army Air Force can do.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it is.
Moving just in 1943, early 43, in Russia. Of course, the Russians have been at war for several years at this point as well. And in the early days of 1943, you can see the map here.
Yeah, 1943, the first couple of weeks, month really of 1943 is when the victories at Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Stalingrad all come together. And I would also argue the final push across North Africa that started at El Alamein. And so this is a real turning point in the war. This is the Axis tide is cresting and it's beginning to recede. This is a map of southeastern Russia, the Caucasus. You can see Stalingrad there, kind of just to the center, a little bit to the right center. That's where the German 6th Army had surrendered, and 91,000 Germans went into captivity. And then the Russians pushed them back basically to where the eastern border of Ukraine is today. And some of those battlefields are the same battlefields in the headlines. But the red area, you'll notice, the Russians pushed into February of 43. And then the red area, the Germans launched a counteroffensive. It's really one of the last great German operational victories of the war. And it was won by Erich von Manstein, basically stabilized the situation. And if that front line looks somewhat familiar in places, it's because it's, very much the same geography as what's going on in Ukraine today. But it stabilized the situation and at least gave both sides a little bit of breathing room. But there's no question that the Germans have suffered heavily. They conquered most of this map by November of 1942, and were driven back in the space of about 10 weeks by the Russians.
What was the Russians' main offensive? Armor, artillery?
It was primarily armor. It's one of the big things about this campaign is that the Russian army from 1941 to 42 had undergone a modernization, and they had really done a lot to reform doctrine, also reform command systems. But one of the big things they did was in 1941, most of the time your tanks are in brigade level deployments, so very, kind of small penny packets. And they learned from the Germans that armor in mass is a better thing. And so now you've got tank corps, and you've also got, during this operation, the first tank armies that are appearing. And they basically cut right into the German rear, and they're starting to adapt the German playbook for themselves. And a lot of those the red area there, those are Soviet tank armies that were penetrating deep into Ukraine, and then were turned around and isolated and destroyed by German tanks themselves, tank units, who then exploited back and recovered some of the ground. So you're starting to see the war. Both, Russia is, the Red Army's learning, and the Red Army is developing, and they're developing the skills and the muscles that ultimately will take them all the way to Berlin in 1945.
Now, is this some of the Russian occupied areas that are now today's Ukraine? Is this some of where the genesis of this current conflict has come from, or are there other underlying things there?
Part of it is that's a whole presentation in itself. As a matter of fact, we did a presentation on this at the Veterans Museum. Actually, the area in the very eastern part of Ukraine is known as the Donbass, and it's in the area basically just kind of in the center, just a little bit left center of the map there, right where the Sea of Azov kind of ends. And that is a very industrial area. In fact, the Russians, there you go. The Russians called that, even as 1920, the heart of Russia. And so that's something that should be kept in mind. The Ukraine also, at the time, and still is, a breadbasket of Europe. And so it's a rich economic prize to whoever controls it. The other thing I would mention is when you think about mentality, look at where that front line is, and you think about the impact of this war on the Russians. The Russians all through the war lost an average of 12,000 casualties every day from June 22nd, 1941 to May 8th, 1945. Again, this is a whole presentation in itself. I'm being quick about it. So think about what that means. Okay, you start adding those numbers up and you realize that scars a nation for generations and embeds itself into the psyche. So the idea that, think about the idea of Ukraine possibly joining NATO, and all of a sudden NATO's eastern border approximates this sector of German front line. And that rattles a lot of ghosts, particularly in somebody like Vladimir Putin, whose parents almost died during the siege of Leningrad during World War II. He was born after the war. They almost died during the war. And so, when you think about mentality, remember stories like this, because it influences the emotional memory of both sides.
Indeed. But you mentioned in your remarks too the Allied victory in North Africa, which is also part of our history in 43, really a turning point there as well.
Exactly. First of two armies that will surrender to Dwight Eisenhower. There's about 300,000 Germans and Italians that surrender, including what's left of the vaunted Africa Corps. And this also, if you want to talk about developing muscles, the muscles of coalition warfare and the muscles that the Allies, the Americans and the British and kind of the techniques that they develop that will lead to the successful prosecution of Operation Overlord and the invasion of Normandy in 1944 and South France, and then all the way into central Germany in 45. Those muscles are developed in North Africa and to an extent in Sicily. And it was Rick Atkinson in his great book, An Army at Dawn, talked about. He referred to it as an army. The U.S. Army was an army on training wheels, and it was also a coalition that was learning to work together. And it's no accident that a lot of the same names that you see in the victory in North Africa and Tunisia, and then ultimately into the Mediterranean, end up working together for the Normandy crossing in 1944. And so this is very important. This is a very important operation, very important in the development of the U.S. Army as a coalition partner, and as I mentioned, one of the great German defeats of the year.
Mm-hmm. And moving on now to sort of Eastern Europe, kind of crossing back over into the European area.
For the listeners, we're doing a very broad survey of the war, and most of these could all be discussions in and of themselves, but we're trying to give people a sense of what's going on. Stalingrad And the defeats of early 1943 shattered the myth of German invincibility, that Blitzkrieg had run out of blitz, as somebody said once. The military pivot, however, of the Eastern Front is this battle here, Kursk. And it's no accident that the Russians have named some of their most prominent ships Kursk, or after elements of this battle. There was a submarine that was famously lost in 2000. That was one of Russia's most advanced, Kursk. Largest tank battle in history. Germans launched the offensive on July 5th, 1943. About 2 weeks. The idea is to pinch off the Russian salient. You can see the map on the right is kind of a blow up of the battle. And you can see on the left there the overall scenario, the overall situation on the Eastern Front. And the idea is to pinch off and destroy that part of the Russian army, and basically, hopefully, knock out their ability to launch an offensive in 1943. It doesn't work, as you can see. The Russians had been waiting. They knew it was coming. It was obvious that it was coming. And it ends up being some of the largest and most intense tank fighting in history, surpassed only by Desert Storm.
Wow.
But when the fighting starts on July 5th, it does not end until the winter of 1943-44. And by that point, the Russians have pushed almost back to the pre-war Polish border and the Romanian border. This is the military pivot, because what Hitler has done is to make this offensive, he's basically pushed all his chips, all his armored reserves, all of his best troops into this offensive and bet everything on winning here. And they suffer very serious losses. So the swords that he had reforged are dulled. And then all of a sudden the Russians pull up all these reserves that they've been waiting in the rear and launch new offensives, and it puts the Germans back on their heels, and they start a retreat back that'll last the rest of the year. Yeah. So this is in many ways the military the psychological turning point was Stalingrad and the Caucasus, which we looked at earlier. This is the military turning point of the Eastern Front, and is in some ways is the high water mark, even though it's not the geographical high water mark, it's probably the high water mark of the Germans in the East.
Yeah. We'd mentioned North Africa just a few moments ago. Of course, that helped set up the invasion of Sicily and eventually moving up into Italy.
38 days in Sicily, July 10th to August 17th. This knocks Mussolini out of office and puts Italy a very short step from going out of the war. It is also the first time an American field army goes into action since 1918 in 25 years. The U.S. 7th Army under George Patton lands to the west, and Patton does what Patton does. I'm sure many of you in the audience have probably seen the movie, and you know what was depicted there. It's some ways both one of his best battles. It shows him at his best, but it also shows him at his worst with the slapping of the soldiers. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, it's a great Allied victory. And by taking Sicily, which sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, they secure the Mediterranean Sea lines of communication from Gibraltar all the way to Cairo. And it's no longer going to be an Axis lake. And from this point, it's actually going to be primarily an Allied lake to a great extent. And so that makes this battle very important. And again, it's one of those where it develops. You see some of these leaders that are involved here, like Omar Bradley, George Patton, Bernard Law Montgomery, Arthur Tedder, Dwight Eisenhower, end up commanding the invasion of Normandy a year later.
And back to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. This map actually illustrates what we were talking about. And one of the things that should be noted is one of the reasons Hitler actually called off, as he put it, the offensive at Kursk, is because notice Kursk started July 5th, the invasion of Sicily, and the Germans, having committed all their reserves to the east, all of a sudden have this major issue in the Mediterranean, a new front in the Mediterranean, and they can't respond. And basically Hitler's decision, okay, let's withdraw some of the troops from Kursk and head them west. Well, that's just the opportunity the Russians were waiting for. And you can see the impact here. This is the summer and fall offensives into what is now eastern Ukraine. And again, similar battlefields to what we see. And the scale on this map, which is, I forget exactly, but it's a big map. I mean, you're talking about an area, an advance of an area that would cover from New York at least to Cleveland, if not maybe Toledo, with a land area to match.
Yeah.
It's some tremendous battles, titanic battles, but the Germans, you'll notice, are retreating, and they will not get the momentum back. They will not get the offense and the initiative back.
Because not only are they battling there, but now the Americans and the Allied troops are invading Italy, and Hitler still wants to try to prop up the Italian government as much as he possibly can as an ally. But again, you're seeing the reserves and the troops being split apart and really getting very thin in many, many areas.
Absolutely. And actually this avalanche occurs the day after Italy surrenders. And so, this, we talk about the struggle for supremacy. I'm hoping that's coming clear. You'll notice the Germans, the Axis, are in a good situation. There's two Axis powers in Europe, major Axis powers, Germany and Italy. But here we are by September 1943, there's one.
Yeah. And
it's Germany. I mean, there are lesser allies, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. I'm not trying to discount them, but the Rome-Berlin axis is the foundation of the Axis powers. And all of a sudden, half the Rome-Berlin axis is gone by late summer. And that's a big deal. Not to mention the fact that now the Russian front, the Russians are beginning to push west. Yeah. The Germans have lost supremacy, and the Allies are closing in from east, west, and south. And to your point about reserves, I would note, if you look at all these, you'll notice there's 2 parachute divisions, several armored infantry divisions, and a couple of armored divisions that are badly missed on the Eastern Front during this time, that are here defending Italy against the British 8th Army, and then, of course, the U.S. 5th Army, which lands at Salerno.
And we continue pushing to the north.
Yep. And this is something Hitler actually made a decision to hold south of Rome, despite some of his generals proposing that they hold actually up north, either in the northern Italy or even as far as the Alps. He didn't want to give up the area, so it takes more forces to defend more of the peninsula. And so that's what happens here. It stalls the Allies, though. It stalls them out. You can see them advancing toward Cassino there to the very northwest of the map. But at the same time, this is strength that is badly missed in the east. And that's one of the reasons why Italy was invaded, not only for to knock Italy out of the war, it was also invaded to secure the air bases at Foggia, which are basically in the upper center of the map, for the 15th Air Force. That's where 15th Air Force is going to operate with great success. But the other thing is to tie down as many German troops as possible, so that you don't have to fight them either in France or you don't have to fight them in Russia. And the Italian campaign, as frustrating as it is, does that rather well.
Is there any reasons why Hitler decided that Rome was the place to make the stand? Was it just his preference, or was there some other thinking behind that decision that he made?
Short answer is prestige.
Okay.
That, and he didn't want to. He's well documented to not want to give up ground if he can avoid it. Mm-hmm. But the idea of capturing, and it was when Rome actually fell on June 4th, 1944, it was a major international victory for the Allies, because it was the first of the 3 major Axis powers to have their capital taken. Even though Italy was out of the war by that point, the symbolism is huge. Yes. And let's be honest, Hitler's an art student. Rome, Florence, we should never discount, when we think about some of these leaders, we should never discount emotional aspects of decision making. And this is one of those where I think the emotion played into it as well.
We mentioned the 8th Air Force and Ira Eaker taking over on this day back in 1943. Here are some of the other sort of highlights in the air war in Europe and over the Atlantic. Starting, of course, with the Dam Busters raid in May of 1943, very famous for the 617 Squadron.
Absolutely. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about aviation milestones, is you look at the dam busters and the sheer ingenuity to bust those dams and what it did. Operation Tidal Wave, which has been called one of the greatest missions in the history of the Air Force, but also one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Air Force, considering the loss rate. Where B-24 is going in low, and when one of the pilots was asked how low, he said, "When I came back, I found that on my antenna on the bottom of my ship, I found what sunflowers and some things that he said, quote, looks suspiciously like grass," unquote. And it's just against the in Romania, the oil refineries, just an incredible mission. And when you think about where aviation technology is, even in 1939, there are things that are being done that were not conceived when the war started. And the same thing with the ball bearing battles of Schweinfurt and Regensburg, two of the more intense air battles in my book over Europe in the entire war. And what that means, and also demonstrates to the 8th Air Force that a long range fighter is necessary. There had been all this debate in the interwar period. The bomber mafia. Oh yeah, the bomber will always get through, which is true to an extent, but bombers unescorted will suffer unacceptably high loss ratios. And it's from this that the air tanks and the P-47s and the P-51s of 1944 make a huge difference. And so it's a huge moment, a turning point, inflection point, call it what you will, in the air war over Europe. Because if they don't fix the problems that are identified at Regensburg and Schweinfurt, both in August and October, 8th Air Force is going to have very serious trouble preparing and supporting the invasion of Europe. Fortunately, they do fix it, and it helps enable Operation Overlord to happen.
And of course, now we're also turning the tide with the U-boats, which had been pretty much operating with impunity in the early days of the war. Now we're starting to see the American forces fight back and try to turn that tide, as it were, as well.
Absolutely, and this is an area where aviation is critical. Code breaking is a big part of this. I'll be the first to say that. If you actually look at when we cannot read German codes, U-boat codes, and you notice when the Germans have a better rate of sinking ships, they match. So we break the German codes. Germans change their codes in January. We finally break them again in May. But in the meantime, some of the things that have happened is we're developing escort carriers. We're sending out hunter-killer groups. So you're taking aircraft. And there used to be this section in the middle of the Atlantic called the air gap, because land-based air could only fly so far. Well, now that you have, first of all, escort carriers, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Second thing is they've now developed longer range bombers, particularly B-24s and the Sunderland flying boats and the Catalinas. Those things, the air gap closes. And so the Germans, who used to be able to wade out of Allied air cover range and then hack into the convoys as they went, can't operate that way anymore. And they begin to realize that is changing, and that Allied supremacy is taking over in the convoy battles, particularly in March. And then by the end of May, the German Admiral, Karl Dönitz, has realized he's lost so many U-boats. He has to withdraw, reconsider tactics, and reconsider even some of his technology before sending them back out again, and basically concedes the field for the Allies. And the Germans U-boat will be a threat till the end of the war, but it will never be the threat again that it was the first 4 or 5 months of 1943 or earlier in the war. And this makes a huge difference, because if you don't win the Battle of the Atlantic, Britain starves. But also that massive American army that ends up fighting in France can't get across the Atlantic. And so this is huge. This enables much of what happens in 1944 and 45.
And now to some warmer climes. As we go to
let's look at the other side of the world now, Steve.
The other side of the world.
There's a lot going on in the Pacific too.
Yeah, the Bismarck Sea is one of those battles that's just sort of it's mentioned, but it's not really. It doesn't come up in historic conversations as much as I think it should.
I agree. And from an aviation perspective, this is a tremendous thing. In fact, the modern Air Force continues to use this as a case study for aviation and anti-shipping use. For those of you who may or may not know, the Japanese sent a convoy of 8 ships and 4 destroyers in late February from Rabaul. It was the 51st Division and the headquarters of the 18th Army to New Guinea to reinforce the Japanese who had just lost in Papua. And they were trying to reinforce to go on a counteroffensive. Code breaking had revealed it. Aerial reconnaissance goes out, and this is Royal Australian Air Force and U.S. Army Air Force involved, 5th Air Force. They find them, and in the course of about 3 days, absolutely smash that convoy. None of them transports get through. Only about 3,000 of the 10,000 or so on board get through. And they use innovative tactics. They've actually modified the ships so that they can strafe with heavier guns. They've practiced what's called skip bombing, where they'll skip bombs along the water. Instead of bombing from very up high, they'll come in at masthead height. You'll see some dramatic pictures from this battle of B-25s at masthead height. And so it's one of those tremendous moments where American aviation really takes over. And one of the things in the Pacific, when you consider the Pacific War, you realize, unlike in Europe, where it's a little different interaction. You know, the Navy brings the Army across, the Air Force wins air supremacy, and then the Army marches to Berlin. Out here, without air, land, and sea all working together, particularly without air, as Douglas MacArthur said, you need more air, and when you get that, you need more air after that, and so on and so forth. Without all those working together, you're not getting to Tokyo. And Bismarck Sea illustrates that very well. The power of land-based air and the power of air to project power over a wide area of islands and sea.
And definitely without that victory, I don't know that it necessarily would have turned the tide of the war in the Pacific, but it would have delayed the advances that the Allies would have made if that had not been a decisive victory.
No question, because those Japanese that drowned ended up, we would have had to fight them. The Americans and the Australians would have had to fight them on the land in New Guinea.
Yeah.
And it was tough enough with the ones we had to face.
Right.
But another full division, and the 51st Division they were no slouch. They were good. That was a good outfit. And so and you'll see it again with the submarines, with some of the reinforcement convoys in 44 and 45 in particular. By drowning Japanese troops, it's one less Japanese that then the Americans have to face on the battlefields.
Yes. Of course, the Solomons begin to come into play, along with, as we mentioned, New Guinea, as the picture in the Pacific and the roadmap to victory starts to become a little clearer as we're moving through 1943.
Absolutely. And again, this is the struggle for supremacy, because the Americans have seized the initiative from Japan at Guadalcanal. And they've seized the initiative from Japan in Papua New Guinea. And now, because both sides have a lot of strength in the Solomons, the Americans realize, if we can defeat the Japanese based at Rabaul and in the South Pacific, in Eastern New Guinea and the Solomons, we'll knock out a significant part of Japanese strength and clear part of the road to Tokyo. And so that's where you get the two drives. It's called collectively Operation Cartwheel. And you've got one end, think of two defensive ends trying to meet at the quarterback. You've got one coming from one end of the line, and that's coming up the Solomons from Guadalcanal. And then you've got the other coming up New Guinea, and this one's Halsey, this one's MacArthur. The idea is to drive up and either isolate or meet at the center and crush Rabaul. They end up just isolating Rabaul, but it's a series of operations throughout 1943 and even into the first months of 1944 that ultimately make that happen. And after that, the way is open for MacArthur to start leapfrogging across the Pacific back toward the Philippines, or across New Guinea back toward the Philippines. And also, having this out of the way, it's now time for Chester Nimitz to open the Central Pacific Drive from Pearl Harbor and start pushing west. toward the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, that famous drive right across the Pacific as well. And those two will meet again at the Philippines in 1944. For all that to happen, though, you got to take care of this first, and you have to win these victories in 43.
Also, 43 finds the Japanese in Alaska, which is, again, a little piece of history that's talked about, but not in great depth as far as the Attu and Kiska.
Hindsight has diminished the importance of these campaigns, and I will admit the war was not going to get won or lost in Alaska, but this was also the first American territory occupied by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812.
Right.
For political reasons and emotional reasons, the Japanese have to be evicted, and so the landing on Attu in May of 1943, actually by percentage, is one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. And it's fought in absolutely horrific terrain and terrible weather. It's just, it was incredible. The 2,000 Japanese defenders died almost to a man. And then the Japanese realized we can't hold Kiska. Most of our strength needs to be used elsewhere, particularly in the South Pacific. So they evacuate Kiska. In late July, 5,000 of them, they evacuate without losing anybody under the nose of the Americans. And so when the Americans and the Canadians land there on August 15th, 1943, Japanese are gone. It takes them 3 days to notice that, and they end up shooting at each other and get some friendly fire incidents. But that's how the Aleutians campaign ends. And it recovers those islands and takes care of that. And the Aleutians will be a bit of an air base for some strikes, particularly in northern Japan, and kind of a latent threat to northern Japan for the rest of the war. I will point out, Alaska is important. One of the reasons Alaska is important, and one of the reasons they did want to take Attu and Kiska, is not just emotional. There were over 10,000 aircraft delivered to the Soviet Union as Lend-Lease through Fairbanks and Nome, and then flying them to Siberia. And so the security of that is one of the reasons you want the Japanese out of the Aleutians as well.
Right. Well, you mentioned the Pacific campaign, and especially the Southern Pacific campaign, where most of the action takes place. This is one of our Pacific areas in taking a look at where we are in, I guess it says this is August of 42 on the map itself.
Yeah, the reason it's August of 42 is because that's when these lines were drawn.
Okay.
It doesn't show the front lines. It just shows the different theater commands. Chester Nimitz controlled the Pacific Ocean areas, the North Pacific, Central Pacific, and the South Pacific. And then Douglas MacArthur had the Southwest Pacific area. You can see Hawaii kind of in the right center of the map there. And then if you go from Hawaii southeast down to where the Southwest Pacific area and the South Pacific area come together, that's the Solomons and Rabaul. And then just to the west of it there is New Guinea. And then up in the North Pacific, that's Alaska, kind of sticking its thumb out. And then kind of along the thumb and those dots there, that's the Aleutians.
So that gives you your point about being able to harass northern Japan from the Aleutian Islands is not. It's still a long flight, but it's not an impossible mission.
From the American base at Adak, which is just east of Kiska, about 150 miles east of Kiska. From there to the Japanese bases in what's the Kurile Islands, was Japanese, now it's Russian. 750 miles. It's 1,000 miles to Tokyo. The problem is it's also some of the worst weather in the world. So flying times are somewhat restricted. But when you can fly and you can bomb, it is possible to reach. And the 11th Air Force actually wages a pretty interesting little war up there, for a bomber offensive from 43 to 45 up from the Aleutians. And then, of course, in the center there from Hawaii, you go west from Hawaii and the chain of islands that extend back toward the Philippines, the Gilberts, which is Tarawa, Macon, and then the Marshalls in January of 44. And then you push west to Guam, the Marianas, and from there you can start bombing Japan with B-29s. And then the Philippines and Okinawa. The first stage of that drive across the Central Pacific is what Nimitz is going to launch in November of 43. So again, you talk about struggle of supremacy. The Americans have wrested the initiative from Japan, and now they are basically punching and moving at will. They call it island hopping.
Right.
And they're starting to leapfrog, that process of leapfrogging across the Pacific that will gain a lot more momentum as 44 and then ultimately, of course, 45 plays out.
And it sounds simple, calling it island hopping, but really none of those islands were easy to take. They were all quite costly. But it's the roadmap going to Tokyo and being able to claim the bases, and especially finally getting Tinian, where you have the B-29 base that can easily reach Japan, and really takes the fight to the homeland of the Japanese.
Absolutely. And it goes back to Bismarck Sea and the lesson of Bismarck Sea, and the idea that it validates the idea that land-based air power, in addition to naval power, can control wide swaths of ocean and project far beyond whatever the base is. You see that in New Guinea at Bismarck Sea, and you see it with a vengeance when the Marianas fall in the bombardment of Japan, for sure.
And by this point in the war, later in 1943, the Japanese they've lost their naval ability to fight. They're more or less just trying to hold their own, as it were, and try not to leave too much behind.
Yes, up to a point.
Okay.
The Japanese Navy, actually, the Japanese surface Navy is still pretty intact from its pre-war strength. It had suffered in the Solomons, don't get me wrong. But the Japanese had done something that in retrospect was probably not very smart, is when the drives up the Solomons are pushing toward Rabaul, they take all the naval air from their aircraft carriers and send it to Rabaul, where in the air battles of 43, it is shot out of the sky. And so the aircraft carriers that they have to retrain all those air groups, and there's a diminution in quality that will show up in 44 and 45. But what has happened is their sword, the sword that they've been carrying, is dulling, both from the naval air power perspective, but also just from a surface strength perspective. Although the surface Navy is still in pretty good shape, and we'll participate in some very large battles in 44. But the naval air is in very serious trouble, as is the land air force as well. They've suffered significant. During the Guadalcanal campaign alone, the Japanese lost over 700 aircraft. They lost anywhere from 38,000 to 50,000 aircraft in the entire war. You can't have an air force with that kind of loss rate without losing quality to your air crews. And that's what's happening to the Japanese. That's a close-up there. The Solomons there to the southeastern, and of course, eastern New Guinea there to the west, and then New Britain, Rabaul, kind of in the right center there of the map is the Japanese objective. The Japanese actually, by late 1943, Premier Tojo will say the decisive battles are over, and he will talk about how the real war, he actually says this to the Japanese parliament in December 1943, in the wake of many of these battles. He will say the real war is now beginning, which I find to be a very revealing statement, because if the real war is beginning in 1944, what have the last few years been?
Yes.
But that statement also illustrates the importance and the power of, and the effect of what the Americans and the Australians and New Zealanders, I should point that out. They are involved in these as well. What the Allied coalition has done to the Japanese Empire in 42 and 43.
Always a interesting story. The shoot down of Yamamoto.
This is a whole presentation in itself too, Steve.
Probably a two-parter.
Yeah, probably. This is fascinating. This is a fascinating story on many levels. Admiral Yamamoto, as many of you probably know, architect of Pearl Harbor, architect of Midway, probably one of the greatest admirals Japan has ever produced. Flying on an inspection tour within range of the P-38s at Guadalcanal. Code breaking had revealed this. It goes all the way to Washington whether or not they should go get them. and they plan an ambush. It's a great story of joint warfare. Air Force, Army Air Force, assisted by Navy. In fact, to do the navigation so precisely, they actually fit a ship's compass to the lead plane of the P-38 squadron that goes and does this, because it's more precise for the amount of precise navigation that they have to do to intercept. Think about intercepting, from 500 miles away with precision in those days, using that kind of, pencil and paper mathematics. And they do it. Yeah. And they shoot him down. That's his plane there in the lower right. It's still there. The wreckage is still there today on Bougainville Island. Yamamoto's successor later said, I don't know what, this is almost a quotation, I don't know what to do. And basically despaired of victory without Yamamoto. It had a huge impact on Japan.
And who actually shot down the Yamamoto's airplane?
It depends on who you ask. There's a controversy about it. There's 3 or 4 pilots that are mentioned. I get it. I get why there's, you want to be the one. From all the accounts I've seen, there's at least 2. And you know what? At the end of the day, they got the job done.
Exactly. Here's an interesting tidbit that I did not know about until I started looking through your presentation. I had to do a little research here. I've never heard of the Chindits.
I found this when I wrote my last book on the China-Burma-India theater. And this is an operation in 1943 by a guy named Ord Wingate, who what he called long-range penetration. 3,000 personnel, British, Gurkhas, and Indian troops march into and infiltrate into the Japanese rear, basically to create havoc for a few months, live on air supply, and at some point exfiltrate out. They're basically from February 43 until late April 43. 3,000 go in, they lose a third of them, killed, wounded, captured, missing, but they create a lot of havoc and they validate these concepts, and becomes clear, they give the Japanese some very anxious moments. When it's time to exfiltrate, Wingate breaks the units up into smaller groups of just several hundred men, and make your way to India as best you can. And most of them, including Wingate, make it out. But it also is the first air medical evacuation in history, because and if you could go to the next slide, this guy on the right is a guy named Walter Scott, who's a tremendous officer in the British Indian Army. And he's got a dozen wounded and sick that are not making it to India. And he's not interested in leaving them to the Japanese, because he has a pretty good idea what their fate will be, which would be very unpleasant. So they signal a RAF C-47 who was dropping supplies to them, and put out using sheets, plane land here in a clearing. And the next day the plane lands, and they basically are like, okay, what do you want? Because they don't have radio communication. That's the only way they can communicate. What do you want? And he put, and this is them loading some of the wounded aboard, and then he waves goodbye. There was a Life magazine photographer who took all these pictures and took a few others. And then they take off and fly to India. And these guys, the rest of this party, exfiltrates over the next few weeks back to India. But this is the first major medical evacuation, Medevac, in military history. And it occurred in central Burma in April 12th, 1943.
Amazing. Just a few minutes left here. I just want to go and kind of put the bookend on. We started with the Casablanca conference with Roosevelt and Churchill. Now we have meetings in Cairo and Tehran, and now we bring Stalin into the mix as well.
Exactly. And this, we talked about it at the beginning, how these conferences bookend. The first one is an assertion, we are winning the war, and our war aims are unconditional surrender for Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now in November, December 1943, okay, we are winning the war. How do we finish the job? What does the strategy look like to kill the Axis in the next year or two. And that's where that's the agenda for these meetings. It's also the first of three meetings that Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin will meet. Well, I should say the U.S. president, because Harry Truman is present for the third one, FDR dying. But you can see the decisions that are made. And these are some of the most famous military operations of World War II. D-Day, the invasion of South France. Bagration, which is one of the greatest defeats the German army has ever suffered in its long history. The taking of Rome, which we've talked about, the importance thereof, the Italy attack. All that is decided at Tehran. And then in the Pacific, the two drives that we talked about, that strategy is confirmed and endorsed to push across toward the Philippines. Also, we liked what Wingate did. Let's give him some planes. Let's give him some troops. That's a whole presentation in itself, Steve. And let's drive into Burma, open the land route to China. And oh, by the way, Dwight Eisenhower is going to get the job to lead the invasion of Normandy. Huge decisions that influence the course of the rest of the war, and in some ways influence the course of history over the last 80 years. And so, when you think about where the Allied leaders were in January of 43 and what's on their agenda, and you look at this and its impacts, that illustrates more than anything else the importance of the events of this year and what it has set the stage for going forward.
In your opinion, Casablanca Conference came out with some pretty strong statements and plans, but was it more stating we are winning the war in more of a hopeful tone than in Tehran at the end of 1943, where we're now seeing many, many things turning in the Allies' favor?
I think that's true. If you look at the agenda for Casablanca, particularly when you talk about bringing the French in on the side, it's still a certain amount of organization and asserting. By this point, the way the leaders have met, the way they carry themselves, there's a confidence that we have the advantage. Now, how do we finish the job? And that's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge.
All right, you have a dedication slide here as well.
I wasn't sure if you were going to mention this or not, but we should, some of you may recall I've mentioned this sometimes in some of my other presentations. We've talked about a lot of grand events. We've talked about a lot of big things, but we should never forget that this affects the lives of millions of people. And in this case, this is my grandmother's half-brother who died in one of those convoy battles in 1943, and to this day, his ship lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, south of Greenland, in the dark wastes south of Greenland, and is commemorated at the Tower Memorial in London. But he is one. I use him as an example. He is one of many whose lives were changed based on these decisions, based on the factors, the events, the trends that we've been talking about tonight, and of course, the fates of many millions will be again in 1944 and 1945. But we should never forget, even for all these big things, that these have real effects on real people. And Walter Bascom, that's why I brought him up, and that's why I included this slide.
Very, very fitting. Very fitting. Any final thoughts before we sign off tonight?
I've really enjoyed it, Steve. It's always great working with you. I think we've covered it. It's an eventful year. And I hope, as you mentioned, a lot to the kind of meets the eye. It's like, what really happened compared to the, 44, 45 kind of is overshadowed. But in many ways, this is the essential kind of stage setter for what happens for the rest of the war. And so this year, I'm glad you're giving it its due, because what happened this year really deserves it.
Yes. Tell us again the latest book that you have out, and where can we purchase a copy?
My latest book is called Nations in the Balance. It's about the India-Burma theater of 1943, 1944. And you can get it on Amazon. You can get it wherever books are sold. Either it's also on a Kindle, it's also on digital as well. It's again called Nations in the Balance. Sounds good. And the website for the museum? The website for the museum is wizvetsmuseum.com, WISVETS, museum, all one word, .com. And you can also Google Wisconsin Veterans Museum. We've got some great programs, some great online exhibits and resources related to Wisconsin veterans and what they did. I can find a Wisconsin tie to virtually everything we've talked about tonight. And it's amazing what we have.
That's right. And maybe once the you're expecting snow there in Madison tomorrow, maybe once the snow melts, we can invite folks to come up and see the museum in person.
We're right on the Capitol Square, right in downtown Madison. And yeah, once the snow melts, by all means, come on down and see us.
All right. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Again, don't forget to click the like, subscribe, or follow button so we can let you know about the future shows. As always, if you have an idea for a topic you'd like to hear more about, send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Thanks again, Chris, for sharing your passion with history with us this evening. We really do appreciate your insights, and thank you.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
All right. Until next time, for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.